safety and predictability and control, and really base it in that reality, because that gives people a chance to feel more engaged and more focused because those needs are met. And then we're looking for compassion to be really that base of the resiliency that we're building in ourselves and our team members. And when we say compassion, that's a reminder of not total empathy where you're taking on everyone else's emotions all the time. And it can sometimes feel like a very hard line to walk, but looking for compassion where you're looking at what can I do? What can I support? How can I be supporting them, but without carrying their emotions for them. And then anger, which comes from unmet needs. So some of our discussion last time was around what are the unmet needs and where do you see those show up in your people? Does anyone want to share where they maybe saw some, actually I think we're doing this in a second, but we'll go through the guidelines. Confidentiality, anything that's said here stays here, especially about our own personal organizations. Assume positive intent, adapt, not adopt. So you don't have to do it exactly the way Lisa or I recommend. Instead, take it, make it your own, make it what fits within your organizational culture and within your team culture. And we're all learning together. So bringing up specific areas that are maybe hard, that's a great way for us to all kind of learn and prepare, because the challenge you might have this week might be somebody else's challenge next week. So please feel free to kind of jump in and share and do that. Last week, we were able to look at what are the unmet needs that are going on, or the needs that you can identify within your team. Anybody willing to share one that they saw this week?
I'll share one real quickly. So I was out hiking with my family this weekend in typical Colorado style. You know, we had one nice day, sun was out, so everybody rushes out. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Colorado, you know, some of our trails are really, really wide, lots of space. And we were in open prairie, which is the only place that's not muddy at this time of year. So that's where we were. And I was hiking one direction, and there was a woman running the other direction facing me, and she was probably 10 feet away from me, or 10 feet like apart on the other side of the trail. The trail was really wide, and she stopped and took off her mask and started yelling at me about not wearing a mask, and said, "Can you please wear a mask? It's people like you who are going to make them shut down all the trails, and I really want the trails to be open while we're shut in place, and I can't stand this anymore. I'm feeling so cooped up." And she just went on and on and on. And you know, I have to admit, my immediate reaction was not to react with compassion. I was feeling very unseen, unheard, and mislabeled. But it did flash into my head that what was going on for her was an unmet need for safety. And even though it's outside of the guidelines of what we've all been told about 6 feet, blah, 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 this clearly was a need that was unmet for her. And for whatever reason, she decided that she would try to get that met with me in that moment. And so I just offer that as an example, and that's the kind of thing you typically see in a crisis, where people will have these really strong reactions that seem sort of out of proportion to the situation even, and it's always a flag that somebody has an unmet need. And in fact, the way I view it is when they act out, they're asking for that need to be met, maybe not in a productive or healthy way that's likely to get their need met, but that is really what that is like sort of a cry for see my unmet need and help me meet it in some way. We're starting to move towards reconstruction. And in that process of moving from depression to reconstruction, there's some reconciliation. You know, sort of figuring out what's there, what's real, what's going to stay, what's going to go away, grieving, letting go, making peace with things as they are, and also like a sort of a juggling act because you won't have all the information you need. And so what happens at this point, fortunately and unfortunately, is that it's almost like hitting the reset button, and you have to go back as a leader. You have to go back to like the first step again, defining reality, even when you don't have all the information. defining the reality based on what you do know, talking about what you don't know, and then helping people create a sense of safety, predictability, and control with the current circumstances. The thing that's a little tricky about this stage of reconstruction, when you're still in early reconciliation, as Courtney talked about, there's a lot of grieving going on and people may not be equipped to deal with that or even surface that for themselves and accept it. The other part that's tricky is you don't have a lot of information. And so this stage of early reconstruction is going to change almost week over week. And so there's sort of this rapid cycle of redefining reality. This is what reality looks like today. And then 5 days later, now that we know X, Y, and Z, this is what reality is again and again and again. And that piece, I think if you know that going into it, you're better prepared for it. And so that's part of the reason we're calling it out. And also helping your folks that you're leading, whether it's in your volunteer roles or in your paid job roles, understand that this process might look like that, and that the sands are going to shift for a bit, and you're going to be sort of piloting in a way and feeling into what's happening, helping them understand that and helping them or sort of asking them to stay with you through that process and continue to surface things, and framing it as an open dialogue and an open discovery process can be much more helpful. It's sanity making rather than crazy making, if you understand what's really happened. So we just wanted to call that out because it actually influences, what happens in the next week for you all. And it also influences what we're going to talk about today, which is conflict and resiliency. And so when we talk about conflict, just sort of a level set, I think we tend to have negative associations with conflict, in part because we tend to think of it as right and wrong and the struggle with people for right, who's right, who's wrong. At least that seems to be a fairly common characteristic. And so we ask people to put aside that notion of right and wrong, and really think about conflict as an opportunity to make sure that all views and human beings involved in the process are seen, heard, and valued. And I just want to contextualize that doesn't mean seen, heard, and valued doesn't mean that you agree with everything. And it doesn't mean that you can always meet people's requests. It does mean, though, you acknowledge what they're seeing as that's what they're seeing, and that's part of the equation. And in doing that, you actually help people move on and move beyond and position themselves to look for different solutions. It also is critical to relationship building, which is one of the things about conflict is if we know how to handle it well, it can actually deepen our relationships. It also provides an opportunity to set aside sort of that paradigm of how you're looking at things and see things in a new way, which is critical during a reconstruction period and identifying, the old way of looking at things isn't going to work. We have to actually set all that aside and look for new and look for possible innovations and ways to succeed in this new world. Having those tools with you will be really important. And then after you've done that, then you start to focus on solutions. The other reason we call that out is because that piece around being seen, heard, and valued often becomes more critical for people in a crisis. The more that people feel like they don't have safety, predictability, and control, the more they're going to sort of hold on to at least being seen, heard, and valued. Because they feel completely engulfed by what's happening around them, overwhelmed. And so if you can provide even seen, heard, and valued for people, that will help them move forward with you. And so, Christina and I have done workshops on conflict tools that take a half a day, take 90 minutes. We could spend a lot of time talking about conflict tools by themselves. And we don't have that kind of time today. And so what we'd like to do is just give you a brief overview of 5 basic tools that we have found to be really helpful. And we're going to delve into a couple of them that we think are really critical, especially in crisis. And then as follow-up, we will send you sort of a cheat sheet with all 5 tools. And for sure, you're welcome to, to delve into those more deeply. So I'm just going to give a quick overview. So clarifying is the first one. And when we clarify, we actually approach the situation sort of like we're a scientist in a lab, and we try to look really closely at what's actually happening, like what are the quantifiable facts, and sort of set perceptions aside. That doesn't mean we say perceptions are invalid, they're incorrect, or we dismiss them, but we try to separate those things out. And the reason we do this is the perceptions often will obscure the situation and make it difficult to really get down to what's going on. And the perceptions often are what polarize us around right or wrong. So when people use words like always, you always are late, or you never do this, those are like good examples of perception that we try to set aside. So let's talk about how often and under what circumstances. We do that for three reasons actually. One is to move beyond right and wrong and defensiveness that come with a situation. Number two, it actually helps make sure that we're having the same conversation. I will tell you, as a mediator, several times I've been involved in a conversation where people have a strong difference of opinion, and when we delve into it by just clarifying, we discover they're not even having the same conversation. They're not arguing over the same thing. Or the disagreement is about how they perceive the situation, not the actual situation itself. And then the number three reason we do it is that level of clarity helps us get to solutions. So that's the first one. The second one, identifying needs, we've already talked about, and Christina is going to delve into it a little bit more in a minute, so I'm not going to talk too much about it. The third one is bridging, which is really a tool we can use to make sure that people are seen, heard, and valued. And we're going to actually rehearse that in a little bit. But just to put sort of a little bit of a stake in the ground and say, this is a place where you can make a lot of traction with people, build a lot of bridges, and do a lot of relationship building without having to say right or wrong, without having to even agree, make concessions. It's just a really good tool for doing the human piece. And then often, I've discovered anyway, in negotiating mergers in particular, when people feel seen, heard, and valued, they're often much more willing to set aside whatever their stake in the situation is and look at different solutions. The fourth is making requests. We always think of the request as being I want to go this way to solve the problem, but there's other requests. You can request more time to come back to the situation. You can request more information. You can request just even space and say, like, wow, this is really heated. I'm not, this doesn't feel like we're getting anywhere. Can we just put a bookmark in this and come back to it and set up a time to do that? So there's more that you can do other than just go straight to solution. And sometimes doing that alone, getting more information or having more time or hitting the pause button, allows new solutions to come to the forefront. And then the last stage, or the last tool we highly recommend, is confirming the solutions together. And I think often when we have disagreements and we work through them, we have the foresight to say, okay, so let's just sort of summarize where we came to, and you'll go through that. The next piece, though, is saying, so what are we going to do differently as a result of this conversation? And let's set up a time to check back in and see where we are on changing this. And then having that conversation and structuring it in a way that you focus on questions that aren't, again, about right or wrong or subjective things, as much as focusing on the three key questions we always talk about is like, what do we need more of? What do we need less of? What do we need to stop? And what do we need to keep the same? So it's actually 4 questions. When you use those questions, for that conversation, it helps that conversation continue to focus on solutions rather than sliding back into subjective perceptions or arguments.
Yeah, and I want everyone to take a moment and think about the 5 tools that Lisa just shared. Do any of them, in the chat, if you could tell me, do any of them come to mind as, oh, that's the one I've been missing, or that's the one I think would really apply right now to my team of how I could support them? Is it, bringing people back to just the facts piece, or, helping them feel seen, heard, and valued with bridging? And take a minute to reflect on that and enter in the chat which tool you feel like you could use this week. That's great. Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of the bridging really standing out to people as the seen, heard, and valued. And that's a really powerful one that we'll spend some time on today, as well as I'm seeing from Tanya, the clarifying the facts and the perception. It's often easy to go straight to solution or identify the needs and kind of clarify where are we having the same conversation? Those are all great. Wonderful. Well, we're going to practice clarifying for a minute. What I want you to think about when you're practicing clarifying, because this also helps when we're kind of in a more emotional state ourselves, which, let's be honest, we're all in a little bit more of an emotional state right now than our normal, because our brains are telling us to be on super high alert. So think about it as you're going into it as a scientist or a documentarian. You're only interested in the facts. I honestly even find it helpful sometimes to think about it in like Morgan Freeman's voice when you're trying to like focus yourself, right? Like, what would he say if he was voicing over this situation? What are the facts here? Not just how do I feel? Because we so often go to, oh, you always do that. You always miss the deadlines, or you never get there on time. And those always and never are automatic defense words for the other person, right? They're pulling them into the situation of getting emotional too. And we want to leave out those really emotional words, or about hurt or frustration, or those really powerful ones. And we want to leave out the evaluations of what somebody's intent was. Because what we're really doing is we're using this as an opportunity to check in and clarify what was going on for them too. So if we have the example of Lisa and the runner, right? If it was someone she was invested in, wanted to resolve, instead of just kind of getting them to keep moving on, you would give the example of what I heard you say is that you're concerned for everyone's safety, and you're concerned that they might close the trails. And what that looks like to me, though, is maybe it's a little bit, unnerving, or it's feeling really threatening to have somebody not have a mask on to you at the moment, because it's scary, right? You want to just put those places and leave them that space to say, well, what I meant was, right? And you'll get that a lot. And it's not always the calmest what I meant was, depending on the situation. But it starts the conversation that gives you information to work with about what was important in this conversation to them. What happened from their point of view. Lisa, do you have anything to add to clarifying?
No, I think you really covered it. I think it is about creating that opening, owning your own perceptions of the situation, trying to make it as factual as possible. And often people will come back with their version of reality. And that's where you really understand, like, oh my God, we're just seeing this completely different. I felt attacked in that situation. Like, that woman was really calling to question my competency. She was really concerned about safety. And if we had talked about it, we would have realized we had very different perceptions of the situation and different needs. And then we would have found something that would have left space for us to find something where we could, move forward together. This was a brief interaction. I wasn't terribly invested. What I did do, though, is move as far away from her as I could, so that she clearly felt so that her need for safety was met. I wasn't going to solve all the problem with everybody on the trail not having masks, but I could at least meet that need. So thanks, Christina.
Yeah. And that gives the perfect example, right? If you're invested, it opens up the conversation to get to find out the unmet needs. It gives you that opportunity to start a more informed conversation with them. And it's kind of clarifying as a bit of your fact-finding moment, where you get that chance to really then move on to unmet needs. And sometimes clarifying actually solves the problem. Right? Because you realize, oh, we were actually talking about two different things. Or for some of you, maybe two different concerns about this patient. And actually, we're on the same page. Because sometimes when we're in that place of crisis, it's really easy to miscommunicate. And clarifying just slows us down for a few moments to get on the same page. And then we can move into needs. It can be that common need for safety right now. It can be control. And what you really want to do is, when you're looking at unmet needs, those are often the biggest triggers. And they're also giving you a lot of information about what's important to that person in the moment. We heard Sarah shared a really great example of that mastery or control being a really high need for someone on her team. And that's a great thing to know now, because often what becomes a really big trigger for us is always of some importance to us in the future.
Mm-hmm.
So that space to learn, to master their job, to be really good at knowing the information so that then they can wow everyone, so they can really be sure they're representing your organization well. That's probably going to be an element to be able to start planning for, right? Be planning like, here's the thing I see down the line. Why don't you start taking some time to learn it now, right? And then you're proactively meeting a need. Now, in crisis, we don't usually have the luxury of being proactive and planning. But what we do have is we have the ability to listen and start the conversation. There's some really good questions around, when you hear those frustrated tones in somebody's voice, you're getting the pushback or the shutdown, asking them, what's making you feel uncomfortable about this, right? Or what's frustrating, or what's important to you about taking more time? And then you open up the door to, I really want to be prepared. I want to do it well the first time. Or I feel unsafe in this situation. Something is just making me really uncomfortable about it. And I'm having a hard time putting my finger on it, but that's what's coming up for me, right? So what you want to do is you want to listen in those conversations for are they feeling unseen, unheard? There's some hints in there a lot of times. Valued will often be something like, they didn't respect how much time I had invested in it, right? And that often has, anytime you hear respect, it's often having to do with valued. Balance may be a frustration or a distraction about how much time they have to spend on a certain thing. And that's a great point in crisis. If you have the capacity to go, why don't you take an hour to go get that done, right? It's okay. Walk away from work for an hour and get it done. Then you're giving that person the gift of being able to come back and refocus, because something is feeling like a really big weight for them or a huge distraction. And the mastery, giving, like Sarah gave the example, giving the space to learn it is a huge, powerful tool when somebody's feeling like their mastery is really threatened in crisis, or control, being able to help them identify what they do have some control over, right? What they can impact, what they can drive forward. So listen for those trigger words and then take a moment to go back and reflect on, what does that sound like they're describing, right? And then that'll help when you go into bridging, when you have an idea of what those needs might be.
Yeah. And I'll just add a couple things about the needs piece. One is I've noticed over time that when somebody seems to be stuck, and I think you all know what I mean by stuck, like this thing keeps coming up again and again, and you're like, again with the blah, 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 whatever it is, and you're just like ready to put your foot down. That's always a clue that there's an unmet need that's not been surfaced and met. Yeah. And so that's the place to go, rather than, say like, I've had it. At least try that, the unmet need thing first. The second is what people will verbalize this as often is the negative of that unmet need. So like, I just feel disrespected by that behavior. I feel disrespected by you, or, I feel like you're controlling me, or whatever. So they will use language that tells you what unmet need is. It will come out as, you are not. And that's always an important clue to figure out what the unmet need is. It may not be you that is the problem. And if you can set aside that part and take the need and start to talk about the unmet need, and sometimes you have to change the language. Like, it's very unpopular at work to say, I'm hearing that you need to be valued. Very rarely will somebody stomach that, but you can say, I'm hearing that you don't feel like your work is valued or appreciated, or something like that, and take the you part out of it, and start focusing on their unmet need, and then talking about how to get that need met. People unfortunately don't always have the skills to articulate their unmet needs in a way that isn't like launching it at people. But when they launch it at you, you can take that as a learning opportunity and help them delve deeper. And especially for people that you're supervising or leading, I think that's a really helpful role modeling about how to address needs in a really healthy way.
I'd also add, Lisa touched on the focusing on how to get that need met. As leaders, especially leaders in crisis, I want you to remember, you don't have to be responsible for fully meeting that need.
Mm-hmm.
It is not your job to meet everybody else's needs.
Mm-hmm.
It is your job to look and help them identify it and proactively think about, as you move forward, what can you do to contribute to meeting that need. But it is not your job assignment to take on meeting everyone's need on your team. And so I want you to remember to give yourself that permission in that moment, even if you're involved in, their escalated emotions and things. It doesn't mean that you have the responsibility. And often what the best results come from is if we help them see how they proactively meet their own needs, whether that's setting a boundary about when they feel disrespected, interacting with that peer and setting an expectation or a boundary of how they interact, things like that. So it's not another big lift that you have to be responsible for.
Okay. So I'd like to take a moment to talk about bridging. And rather than talking at you about bridging, I'd like for people who are comfortable with this activity, I'd like everybody to take a moment and remember a time when you had perhaps an unmet need or something that was really upsetting you, and the way you verbalized it to somebody was maybe not that productive. It might have looked like, you launched into, a friend, a colleague, a partner, somebody in your life, and just sort of dumped, just went on and on, or, maybe the tension had been building up, whatever that situation is. I'd like you to visualize that interaction and feel into, how, or remember what that felt like for you, and what their reaction is, and just take 30 seconds to remember that. Everybody there in the ickiness? So I'd like you to think about that situation and think to yourself about how it would have felt if whatever that person did or said, if instead they had said to you, I'm hearing you say you're frustrated. I'm hearing you say you're angry. It sounds like you're really hurt. How would that have felt different to you? And I'd like people to volunteer to type in the chat or even come off mute and could just say to. Diffused, yeah.
That's a great word for it.
Anybody else have a different reaction?
I've been using the analogy a lot when we're in these situations of letting some of the hot air out of the balloon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Would have kept it from escalating. Yeah. Does anybody in the group feel seen or heard in that situation? There's no right or wrong answer. So let's take that same situation. Seen and heard from Melinda, yeah. Let's take that same situation, and what if that person had gone one step further and said something like, I'm hearing you say whatever. I'm wondering if you're feeling angry because, and then talked about an unmet need. Or I'm wondering if you're feeling whatever because of, and then they guess at your unmet need. How does that feel for people? Anybody want to volunteer? Listen to? Like they're present with me. Might make me more angry if they got it wrong. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Sometimes we hear condescending too. Somebody else has said like they want to join with me in finding the solution. All of those things are possible. So the reason we walk through this is just to convey the power of this tool. And I'll say a couple things about it. Context matters. So as you were envisioning this situation, some people are envisioning a situation in which the person that they're with doesn't feel particularly safe, or the situation's really hurtful. And so their reaction to that last piece actually feels condescending. or like they're trying to manage me, right? Manipulate me. Exactly. I was in a workplace once where I was bullied. And if that person had behaved that way, I would have felt very manipulated and belittled. However, if my partner says that to me in a loving, caring relationship, I feel seen and heard, right? So it depends on the kind of relationship. It also depends on the kind of language. The reason we have you go through this exercise is just to convey the power of this tool. And so you can use it when it seems appropriate. You can do sort of the little dip in, which is, you know, I'm just to reflect back what you're hearing. And I would say that there's contexts in which that doesn't feel respectful. And people have a good gut about this. So I'd encourage you to use your gut on that. Or you can go a little bit more and actually guess. The power of the guess is interesting. And I used to, when I first learned this tool, I used to like be so afraid every time I'd use it. And I try it with my teenagers who were always quick to tell me how I was wrong, and usually launched a pretty angry dialogue in telling me that. But what I learned over time is that what mattered to them is that I was trying to understand where they were. Even if their initial pushback at me was angry, they would then come back to clarify what was really happening with them. And we got through and with teenagers, there's a lot of bluster, right? You know, a lot of positioning and bluster, but it disarmed them and we got through to the issue. And I actually use this with really difficult executives as well, who initially often will, you know, beat me up for using the language, and then they'll stop and then they'll clarify what's really going on with them. So it's a little risky. We did a workshop once with somebody who said, like, look, I'm married, I'll tell you what happens, like, you know, what would happen. And this person went on to say, you know, my spouse's initial reaction would be X, Y, and Z. In fact, I've done this, but then we went on to talk about what the real problem was. And for me, it's worth it. And I will also say, you know, depending on the context, not everybody has a negative reaction. So again, this is one of those things, I think Christina said at the beginning, sort of take the best and leave the rest. These are tools for your tool bag that you pull out when the context seems appropriate. But this can be very effective if part of your goal is really to relationship build and trust build with somebody and make sure that they feel seen, heard, and valued. If you're getting the sense that that's the biggest blocker, this is the appropriate tool for you.
This is also one that it's really important to adapt rather than just adopt.
Yeah.
And put it into your own language. If it sounds like it's way out of the language is way different than the way you would speak in a normal situation to your peer or spouse or coworker, then they're going to be like, what are you trying to use on me, right? Versus if you put it in your own language of, you know, wait, what's most important in this situation to you? Or something like that, you're actually then going to help them hear what you're doing and feel heard in the situation better, because we're not distracted. And we've heard that from lots of people that I really have to make it my own language or they're not going to listen to me. And we agree with that. That's something to take some time to, it's a great exercise to take these different phrases and rewrite them in your own words of how would I say that in the moment so I have it practiced so it's more comfortable.
Right. And Courtney just gave an example. Courtney and I work together quite a bit. So she gave an example of something I say, and I know, Mary, you know this too, and maybe Sarah from working with me, and maybe Tanya. I often will say, this is what it looks like to me, but I'm not sure this doesn't mean that's what it is. Please tell me if I'm not getting it right, or please tell me if I'm not accurate. So that's sort of my way of using that language to put an invitation out to people and own that, like, I don't know everything. I want to be corrected. I want to know what's really going on with you. Let's talk a little bit about resiliency during crisis. And I want to make sure we have time to really mastermind with Melinda. So I'm just going to touch on this really quickly. And next week, we really are going to talk a lot about resiliency, but this is the framework or the foundation for that. All the tools, sort of a spoiler alert, I guess, if you will, all the tools we've been using the last, this is our third week, are really the foundation for resiliency. People have to understand what reality is, first of all, and have a sense of safety, predictability, and control, or resiliency isn't even in reach for them. And so that's your first job as a leader, always. So they have that foundation. And then after that, dealing with unmet needs and conflicts, because those get in the way of resiliency. And ironically, helping people work through those things builds resiliency. It's part of them building their own EQ. And then the last piece is really that piece that Christina talked about, is understanding the difference between compassion and empathy. So empathy is when you're all in the suffering with people and trying to solve their problem. And I will say that often when I work with organizations that do a lot of care with people, especially comprehensive care, you'll find burnout in the employee sector, pretty high burnout. And it's often because people are confused or don't understand the difference between empathy and compassion. And so when they're working with people who are in need, they often go sort of into leaning into the suffering and take on the suffering of the people that they're helping, rather than having compassion. The experience of compassion, by contrast, actually helps us feel more energetic and warm and caring without taking on that suffering. It doesn't mean that we don't care about that person's suffering. It just means we don't take it on. And instead, we see our role as like sort of holding space for them so that they can solve the problem with the tools that we're helping them receive. So that may be, housing assistance, food assistance, all those tools, but we are working with them and partnering with them and really giving them the tools to lead their own way rather than trying to solve their problems. And so it's a subtle thing, but it's a really important thing if you're talking about resiliency. So Christine, I know we wanted to come back to Melinda's example. And so would you mind sort of kicking us off on that part?
Absolutely. So Melinda, I want to clarify and have you add just a little bit more information, and then we can kind of jump in to that. What you were saying is there's been
actually,
a lot of...
Christina, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. It looks like the recording light is still on.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
2 seconds.
Mm-hmm. This is one of our not for TV moments. Thank you for your patience.